And the very nature of that debt, you know, a lot of people in this room understand that because you're in the mortgage industry. You know how many people own adjustable rate mortgages and how many people have been able to extract equity from their houses as they've been appreciating. See, the dynamic behind this whole perverse situation was that as Americans spent money, we sent dollars abroad to pay for all the goods that we could no longer produce ourselves, foreigners were accumulating their IOUs. Because since we didn't have any goods that we produced that the Chinese or the Japanese wanted, they were stuck with all this paper. And so their central banks kept buying it. And what did they do with that, with the dollars? They bought U.S. treasuries. They bought mortgage-backed securities. They kept interest rates artificially low. Because in America, we should not have low interest rates. We've had negative savings rates for years. We have hardly any savings. Interest rates are the supply and demand of money. So we have minimal savings, and everybody's trying to borrow. Interest rates should be high. Why aren't they high? Because the rest of the world is loaning us their savings. And that's what kept interest rates low. But as money kept coming back to the United States and buying our mortgage backs and buying treasuries, that kept real estate prices rising. The higher real estate prices rose, the more money Americans could borrow against their houses, the more imported goods we can afford to buy, the more dollars we sent abroad, and it was a process that kept perpetuating itself. And now, of course, the Chinese have over $1 trillion in foreign reserves. That's just the Chinese. The Japanese have nearly $1 trillion as well. And, of course, every other country in the world is collecting reserves. These represent goods that Americans have imported, but that we have not yet paid for. And the way you pay for goods is by exporting, right? Nobody exports for the sake of exporting. You don't export because you want to create jobs, right? The role of an economy is to eliminate jobs. People don't want to have to work. But the reason you export is to import. It's comparative advantage. But the problem is we're not offering the world anything except our IOUs and the promise that at some point in the future we're going to make good these IOUs with a manufactured product. But meanwhile, our ability to manufacture is diminishing with each passing day. And the world is going to wake up and understand this. But anyway, so getting back to where we are, so the consumer went into debt and spent a lot of money to keep this recession at bay. But all that consumption has a price of dramatic reduction in future consumption. You see, the only way that a society can really increase its future consumption is to save. And by definition, savings is underconsumption. It's the lack of consumption. It represents self-sacrifice. But when you save and you reduce your consumption today, and you have money that you can invest, and you have compound interest and returns, ultimately you can enjoy enhanced future consumption. In America, we're indulging ourselves, or we have indulged ourselves, in the present at the expense of the future. And a nation is no different than an individual. Just like if there's one individual who works hard, and doesn't take as many vacations, doesn't buy new cars, doesn't eat out a lot, saves a lot for his retirement, you know, he's building something for the future. You take another similar situation, a guy with the same income, but saves nothing, takes out a second mortgage on his house, you know, doesn't have a retirement account, you know, doesn't save for his kid's education, and just spends everything he earns. Initially, that person's economy looks pretty good if you simply measure it based on consumption, which is what we do when we measure our GDP. But you're not looking beneath the surface to say, at what expense is this consumption being funded? That's the big difference. And also, I wanted to just digress briefly on government statistics. You know, it was mentioned by Barry that, you know, our inflation rate is so low compared to what it was in the past. And one of the reasons for that, and probably the primary reason for that, is the way the government has changed the way it keeps score of the statistics. Now, back in the 1970s, they took housing prices out of the CPI. They used to be. Back in the 1970s, when we had that high inflation, housing prices were in there. They're not in there now. And in the mid-1990s, they introduced the concepts of hedonic adjustments and substitutions, which basically rendered the CPI worthless, because the government could do whatever they want with it. You know, if the price of something went up, they don't have to count it. It's not a fixed basket anymore. And there's a lot of subjectivity in there, where the government can take a look at something and say, well, the price went up 20%, but we think it's 30% better, so the price went down 10%. There's a lot of subjectivity that's in there now that wasn't in there back then. So when you just look at these numbers, right, and so there's no inflation. I mean, that's, you know, it's like a government weatherman is telling you that there's sunshine, but you look out the window and you can see that it's raining. Now, I'm not going to believe the government when I'm going to believe my own eyes. And same thing with the productivity numbers. The productivity statistics were the result of hedonics. If we were becoming so much more productive, where are all the goods we're producing, and why can't I see that in the balance of trade? If we're so productive, where are the exports? Why do we have to import so many products from the rest of the world if we're more productive than they are? So you can't hide the facts. The government can lie all it wants with statistics, but the facts speak for themselves. You don't go from being the world's wealthiest creditor nation to being the world's poorest debtor nation and somehow claim that you're more productive than everybody else. It just doesn't make any sense. And the difference, of course, you know, when the world is accumulating assets and we accumulate liabilities, we have to make payments on those liabilities. And this is what's going to happen. So anyway, coming back to where we are as an economy, we had the real estate bubble that blew up. Americans took on a lot of debt. We spent a lot of money. Where are we now? Well, over the next year or two, you've got about $2 trillion of adjustable rate mortgages that are going to reset. Now, where are homeowners going to get the money to make these mortgage payments? It's not like they're sitting on a pile of cash. You know, in fact, most people that own homes, when they qualified for their mortgages, they bought the biggest monthly payment that somebody would approve them for, even at that low rate. So if they got a teaser rate of 6% or 5%, they maxed themselves out. They're spending 40% of their income on their mortgage now at the low rate. How are they going to afford to make these payments when the rate's 8% or 9%? Well, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to cut back spending on anything else. No more eating out, no more shopping at Walmart, no more cable TV, no more cell phone. I got to make this mortgage payment. Well, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. The minute Americans stop spending, because all their surplus money is now going to make interest payments to the Chinese and the Japanese, or to pay, you know, higher costs for gasoline or food, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. A lot of people in America earn their living on discretionary spending. In fact, most of us earn their living on discretionary spending. A lot of people are going to lose their jobs because Americans are struggling to make mortgage payments instead of spending money on what they're spending it on now. Of course, a lot of Americans got their spending money from home equity extractions. As their real estate was going up, they kept borrowing against it. Well, you can't borrow against it anymore when all the equity has already been borrowed out, or real estate prices start to fall. Interest rates on the long-term rates are still not any higher than they were 4 or 5 years ago. But what's higher are the short-term rates. And that's where these adjustable rate mortgages are all set, at the short term. Also, of course, a lot of people don't realize this too, but one of the things that the Clinton administration did and the Bush administration was we put the entire country on an adjustable rate mortgage. The U.S. government used to finance its borrowings with 30-year paper. Now the average maturity on the national debt's under 3 years. It's almost $9 trillion in debt as an adjustable rate mortgage. So as interest rates rise, it's going to impact the federal budget. And there's probably going to be quite a bit of tax increases in the pipeline because of the larger deficits that are in our future. Of course, that means homeowners are not only going to have to face higher mortgage payments, but they're going to have higher taxes as well, in addition to higher costs for food and groceries and things like that. So we're going to have a very severe recession as a result of that contraction of consumer spending. Also, Americans are going to have to rebuild their savings, replenish their savings. For the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of Americans felt, why save? I own a house. I don't need to save. In fact, a lot of Americans said, I don't even need a job. I own a house. You go out in California,